Hi, my name is Ike and I make a lot of my own clothing. And I also hand sew every single buttonhole I put in a garment. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I do it. I think hand sewn buttonholes look a whole lot better than machine worked buttonholes, and I also think they wear better as well. The only advantage a sewing machine really has is that it's going to be a lot faster than hand sewing. First, let's talk about thread. You want to choose a thread that suits the fabric. So on lighter weight fabrics, you're going to want a lighter weight thread. Heavier fabrics, you're going to want a heavier thread. In general, though, the heavier the thread that you choose, the less stitches you're going to have to do, and the more full the buttonhole is going to look. I like to use linen thread on cotton garments. I'm sure you could find cotton threads in similar weights, but I like using linen thread because I've worked with it for a while now and I knew what weights were available and what I liked working with. This is the thread I like to use on heavier fabrics like denim or canvas. It's a 16-2 linen thread from the Swedish brand Bockens, Bockens. 16 refers to the weight and it's a 2-ply. It's a lot heavier than an all-purpose thread. This is Syntex 40 thread for comparison, which is on the heavier end of what we consider all-purpose thread. I've used this weight of linen thread as well, most recently on my denim fatigues in white. It's the same brand, but it's a 35 weight, so it's a little more than half as thick as the 16 weight thread. You can also use silk thread. This is some Tire brand silk buttonhole twist. I got this from Superior Threads. I like to use silk threads for buttonholes primarily on wool garments. This stuff is meant specifically for sewing buttonholes. I like to cord my buttonholes, which is adding a cord underneath the buttonhole stitches. This will provide some additional reinforcement and structure to the buttonholes. It will also make them look more 3D. It fills in some of the visual space between the buttonholes and makes them look more full as well. I like using this hemp cord from the brand Hemptique. I believe this is their number 20 size, which is about 1 millimeter wide. I got this when I worked at an art supply store and I really liked it, so I've ended up using it a lot. I've also used the 16-2 linen thread to cord under either itself or a lighter weight thread. Like on this jacket, I stitched the buttonholes in 16-2 linen thread and corded them with the same. I'd encourage you to experiment and figure out what works best for you and your projects. These are the tools I'm going to use. I like to use a chisel to cut open my buttonholes. These are just woodworking chisels that I got at the hardware store. The most common sizes that I use are 3/4 of an inch and 5/8 of an inch. To get the keyhole part, I use what's known as a hollow punch. Again, I got this from a hardware store and I think this is a 1/8 inch size. To lay out the buttonholes, I'm going to use 2 rulers. I've got a clear plastic ruler. I find it really helpful to keep everything square, and then I've just got a standard 12-inch stainless steel ruler because I find it easier to read. To mark the buttonholes, I've got some chalk. I don't like the waxy sort of chalk, so this is from the brand Triple S, and I really like it. I've got a pair of scissors to cut threads, and then I've got some sewing needles. These are from the brand Bohin. These are sharps with a big eye, which I find really helpful because I'm often working with quite heavyweight threads. In general, you want to choose a needle that suits the thread and the fabric you're using. So heavier thread and fabric, you want to choose a larger needle, and lighter weight thread and fabric, you want to choose a lighter needle. I also find a pair of pliers comes in handy, especially if you're working with heavy threads or fabric. When laying out a buttonhole, I want them to be slightly wider than the button. So I'll measure the button, and this one is just over 1/2 inch. So I'll use the 5/8 inch chisel to cut it open, which will give me about 1/8 of an inch of clearance. When I go to lay it out, I'll make sure it's square to the edge using my clear ruler, and then I'll mark it with chalk. I usually set my buttonholes about a 1/2 inch back from the edge of the piece. And I'm just using the clear ruler again. It makes it really easy. And then I'll measure out the finished width of the buttonhole. Mark that with chalk. Something that you could do is run a line of basting stitches around the buttonhole before cutting it. This will keep the layers from moving, which is great for fabrics that tend to shift. On something like denim or canvas that is a little more solid, I don't bother. The pieces I'm working on tend to be quite narrow, like a buttonhole placket on a pair of jeans or the facing on the front of a jacket, and it won't move much anyway. If I do go and baste, what I'll do is run a line of basting stitches about a 1/2 inch back or so from the buttonhole. It doesn't need to be pretty, it just needs to hold the layers together. If I'm basting several buttonholes in a row, I'll just daisy chain between them and then snake back and forth. To cut open my buttonholes, I've got a wood block underneath the piece so I don't mess up my table. Just lining up the chisel with the chalk mark I made. You could use like a self-healing cutting mat here. It'd probably be better for your chisels because my chisels are really not sharp at this point. If your chisels are sharp, you should be able to just use your body weight to cut them open, but I'm using a hammer. Lining up the punch is sort of tricky because I want it centered on that line I just cut. But once I've got it lined up, I'm just using the hammer again. You could trim off the corners here to make the buttonhole more of a teardrop shape, but I don't usually bother. Something I would recommend you do, especially if it's your first time hand sewing a buttonhole, is going in and whip stitching the edge of the buttonhole before working the buttonhole stitch. I don't usually bother with this step though. It will help hold the layers of the fabric together and should help prevent any fraying, and in general make the buttonhole easier to sew. It also gives you the chance to sort of sketch out the size and shape of your finished buttonhole. I'm using a lightweight cotton in a contrast stain color here because it's what I had on hand. You could choose a thread that's closer to the color of your fabric because there's a chance you'll see the stitching underneath the buttonhole stitches. If you decided you want to cord your buttonhole, I would recommend whip stitching in the cord as well at this point. It means you won't have to deal with making sure the cord is in the right spot as you're stitching the buttonhole. I don't usually bother with this step though. When determining how long of a piece of thread to cut, in general, you want a piece about the length of your arm. It's more comfortable to have a length of thread that you can fully draw up when you extend your arm. Longer threads also tend to get twisted and can get knotted. Linen thread really needs to be waxed before you can sew with it. To wax my thread, I'm just using some beeswax and I'm using my thumb to apply some pressure, pulling the thread through a few times. I also like to pinch the thread and draw it through my fingers to remove any excess wax. Since this thread is so heavy, I'm not going to double it. I'm just going to work with a single length of it. I'll thread my needle and then pull through a few inches to anchor my threads as I'm working with it. Since I didn't whip stitch the cord in place, I'm just going to hold it in position as I stitch. And I don't have it right against the cut edge, but slightly below it. I don't like to tie a knot if I don't have to, so I'll bury my needle in between the two layers. And when I draw it out, I'll leave a small tail that I can trim down later. I came out of the fabric right where I want my first stitch, which is below the cord and in line with the end of the buttonhole. I'm going to form my first stitch by making a counterclockwise loop and insert the needle from the wrong side through the same spot, and that will anchor my threads and create my first stitch. As I'm pulling that up, and I'm positioning the knot that forms right outside the cut edge, so slightly on the face of the fabric. And then I'll just continue making counterclockwise loops, stitching through the back side to the right side to form the next stitch. I like to hold the loop in place with my thumb as I'm stitching through the fabric. You could, in theory, get the knot in the right spot just by pulling the thread. The angle you pull it at will determine the position of the knot. But I like to pull lower on the thread closer to the buttonhole to make sure it's in the right spot. I've found since you're repeatedly looping the thread, it's very prone to getting twisted, which can lead to a knot forming before you've fully drawn up the thread, and taking a little more care when you're drawing it up can prevent that. Tension is important here. Too tight and it will start to curl the fabric and distort the buttonhole. Too loose and it won't look nice or be very functional. I like to work away from myself, with the buttonhole at a right angle to my body. That's the most comfortable way I've found to sew these. You could work the stitches a lot closer together, but I found that sometimes when you stitch them really close together, they can start to lean forward. In general, I space my stitches about the width of the thread I'm using apart. I'd highly recommend doing a couple test buttonholes to get a sense of what thread you want to use and what sort of spacing and tension works best for your project. There's a few ways you can form the stitch. You could put the needle in first and then wrap the thread around the needle in a counterclockwise direction, like I'm doing here. But I like the method where you put down the loop first and then stitch through it. It feels more intuitive for me, and I found it's easier to manage the cord this way. When I get to the rounded part of the buttonhole, I'm going to start doing a couple of things differently. Because the interior circumference of that circle is slightly smaller than the exterior, I like to move the knot slightly farther onto the face of the fabric. I found that if I try to stitch them at the same angle as the stitches on the straight parts, it gets a little tight inside the curve. To accommodate moving the knot out a bit, I also want to take a slightly deeper stitch than I did on the straight parts of the buttonhole. As I work my way around, I also want to fan out my stitches a little bit, with the interior end of the stitches closer together than the exterior ends. Again, this is because the interior circumference of that circle is smaller than the exterior circumference. You can see how much work I'm having to do in order to make sure the cord is in the right spot, since I didn't whip stitch the cord in place. I think the time I save not whip stitching is probably more than the time I'm wasting making sure the cord is in the right spot though, so it all works out in the end. As I move into the second half of the round portion of the buttonhole, I like to try and mirror the stitches that I took in the first half. I found the better of a job I do at mirroring the stitches on either side of this section at the front of the buttonhole, the better it's going to look in the end. As I'm moving around the buttonhole, I'm also rotating the piece so that it remains perpendicular to my body. Practice is so important when it comes to sewing buttonholes. I've sewn hundreds at this point, and I think it took me sewing at least a couple dozen before I was consistently happy with how they turned out. I also find the more frequently I sew buttonholes, the better they turn out. If there's long breaks in between, I can tell I'm a bit rusty, and it takes a few to get warmed up. Something to keep in mind is the posture of your hands and wrists. Hand sewing can really mess them up. Things like carpal tunnel syndrome are caused by bending your wrists as you're working, so I try to keep my hand in line with my wrist to prevent pain and injury. I'm getting back to the straight part of the buttonhole, so I'm adjusting the angle and position of the knot again so it matches the first side. And then I'm just working my way down this other side. I often like to use my thumb as a reference to help me gauge the depth of stitch I'm taking. If I line it up with the last stitch I took, I can get an idea of where I should take the next stitch. I've also found that just getting in a rhythm and trying not to overthink where you're putting the next stitch can really help keep things consistent. I'm not wearing a thimble here, in large part due to the fact that I didn't learn with one, and it feels awkward to wear one for me, and I don't really feel like relearning to sew with one. I'm also not pushing the needle a lot with my finger. I'm really just inserting the needle where I want it and then pulling it through. This is the most basic version of a buttonhole stitch, and functionally very similar to a blanket stitch. There's a variation that includes a second loop and is often referred to as a tailor's buttonhole stitch. I find it overly complicated and a little bit fiddly, when this produces just as nice of a result. I haven't addressed what's going on with the ends of the cord. If your cord is light enough, you could use the needle to bury the ends between the two layers of fabric, or I've just left them untrimmed on past projects. On this, though, I'm going to clip them before I work the bar across the end. I'm almost at the end of the buttonhole here. I think I actually did one stitch too many. You really want the last stitch to line up with your first stitch. I was able to fix this while I was working the bar across the end. To form that bar, I'll take the needle and put it through from the wrong side, and I want to come out just below the last stitch. Then I can take a few stitches across the end of the buttonhole to give me something to work a series of buttonhole stitches over. I'm trying not to go all the way through the fabric here, just through the right side. I'm lining the ends of these stitches up with the bottom of the first and last stitches. The number of stitches you take really depends. I did 3 here, and I think one more would have visually matched the weight of the rest of the buttonhole. I want the last stitch to come out just below those stitches I put in. I'm going to trim off the ends of the cord at this point. It's anchored well enough by the buttonhole stitches, and I haven't had any issues with it shifting or coming out doing it this way. And then I'll start working buttonhole stitches over those threads, passing the needle under the last stitch I took on the opening of the buttonhole, underneath the bar, and grabbing a few threads of fabric below the bar. And then I'll pull that up, and I want the knot to point towards the rest of the buttonhole. You don't need a ton of stitches across this bar. I ended up with 5. I did two through the last stitches on the opening of the buttonhole, one at the center in line with the opening, and two more through that first stitch I made on the other side. Grabbing the first and last stitch I took on the opening as I'm stitching over the bar helped me disguise the fact that I went too far on one of the ends, and it really ties the whole buttonhole together. Working this bar is the spot that I usually find pliers really come in handy, especially if you're working on a heavy fabric with a heavy thread. And with this last stitch, the buttonhole is all done. To finish it off, you really don't need to tie a knot, since what you've done is essentially stitched a series of knots. So what I'll do is I'll insert the needle right behind the last stitch I took, and I'll bury my thread between the two layers. I didn't nail this since you can see the thread on the wrong side. I like to come out right where I started so I can clip both threads at once. I like to pull on the threads a little bit to draw them up, so when I clip the ends, it should end up between the two layers. You can see them a little bit here, but it doesn't really bother me. I really like to press my buttonholes after I sew them, but this is completely optional. Pressing them through some brown paper will pull out some of the excess wax and fluff up the threads. As you wear and wash them, the wax will also disappear. Since my buttonholes are so 3D, I also like to press around them. This will sort of raise the buttonhole threads back up. I'm just pressing right up to the edge of the stitches all the way around the buttonhole. And that's the finished buttonhole. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. I think maybe the stitches are a little deep, but I don't mind a chunky buttonhole. The backside never looks as good as the front, but that doesn't bother me. Let me know what you think though, and let me know if you have any questions.